Okay, so I will be talking today about Dr. King and four quadrants. I'm going to make the case that Dr. King was a four-quadrant thinker, and he was also centered in the green meme. Green meme being concentrated around love and building connections and building community. So, we're going to begin with a review of what the quadrants are, because everybody listening to this won't know. I know you guys do, but most people won't. So the first quadrant would be the upper left-hand side. So the quadrants is basically a box. And the left side is the interiors, and the right side represents the exteriors. The top half is the singular, and the bottom half is the collective. So it's a way to explain different aspects of a phenomenon in a systematic way, okay? So the first quadrant is the upper left-hand quadrant, and it encompasses a person's personal beliefs. So this is what a person believes on the inside, and that's what's motivating them to do X, Y, and Z. The actual behavior is the upper right-hand side. So here we're going to be talking about the upper right-hand side being behavior. Now, other four-quadrant theorists will talk about structures as the upper right-hand quadrant. For example, the paleo-mammalian brain creates emotions. So the upper left side would be emotions. The upper right side would be the paleo-mammalian brain. But here we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about behaviors. So because you feel attraction to somebody, that would be your upper left-hand side. The upper right-hand outward expression of that would be kissing. Okay? So the lower left-hand side is interior collective. So this is community beliefs, societal beliefs, and zeitgeist. So this would be the guiding principles of organizations. This would be beliefs in a society or a group of people. And then the lower right-hand side is going to be government programs, societal norms, and institutions. So, yes?
Where would you put thinking, like individuals' thoughts?
Thinking, so thinking can be expressed as a behavior, or it can be expressed as interior singular. So in this conversation, we're going to use that upper left. Thinking is going to be upper left for this conversation. Again, the next time you do a presentation on this, it could be upper right, but the lower left-hand side is government programs and societal norms. So, for example,
that's lower right. You said left.
Yeah, lower right. My bad. Lower right. So, for example, if you believe in fetal piety or taking care of old people, then that manifests in a strong Social Security program. So when old people get old, they don't have to still work and things like that. So if you have a personal belief in taking care of old people in the upper left, it manifests as taking care of your grandparents in the upper right. If a group of people believe in fetal piety, that's the lower left. And the lower right expression of that would be building a strong Social Security system. So that's how you would explain fetal piety in four quadrants. And so the issues with taking care of elderly people in the community can be expressed in those ways, and you can talk about it to make it easier to communicate different things about concept. So the next chart is an overview of what I believe Martin Luther King was expressing in the four quadrants. So one thing I want to express is King was centered around Orthodox Christianity. So a lot of what his methodology was based on was the idea that man was a sinner by choice. Love is the only thing that can conquer sin. Fate is an absolute. The universal brotherhood of man, and disparity is the result of social policy. Okay? So in the second quadrant, that manifests itself as a social justice as a spiritual path. Because since faith isn't absolute, you have power to change your circumstances. A person that believes fate is hard and unmovable, they're not going to be for social justice policy. So he believes in nonviolent resistance because he thinks the chief way we should operate in the world is through love. The Brotherhood caused him to outreach to other social justice groups.
The Brotherhood?
Yes, the idea of brotherhood.
Oh.
So that means organizations to the right of him, like the NAACP, and organizations to the left of him, like SNCC and CORE. He always criticized groups, not individuals, and he was anti-war. Now, once you got a group of people that believed in King's philosophy, like the SCLC or the Poor People's Campaign, they centered around liberal Christian theology, using the black church tradition to express that liberal Christian theology. They believed in collective uplift, and also the fundamental soundness of the Constitution and the foundation of America. And that's going to be a very critical point, and it's going to separate King from other black leaders at the time, okay? Now, that expressed itself externally as social justice philosophy. He wrote extensively on how he came to his beliefs. He believed in building a welfare state and building a coalition of unions, social justice advocates, and politicians. Okay? So the interior singular quadrant, as I said, is centered around man being a sinner by choice. Only love can conquer sin. Fate is not absolute. There's universal brotherhood in man, and disparity is the cause of is caused by social policy. Okay? So he was, again, a mainstream Christian, and he supported chiefly liberal theology, okay? So, as you know, there's many different versions of Christianity. As we know as integralists, there's the blue meme, more conservative version of Christianity. There is prosperity gospel, that's the orange meme, where you're using God to become more wealthy or more successful. And then there's green meme Christianity, who sees the correlation between Christianity and all the other faiths. In one of his speeches, he proposes his idea as Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and Buddhist. That chiefly all these religions are centered around the same thing. And the policies he was prescribing could be adopted by anybody of any of those faiths. And he also said Gandhi was the greatest example of Christian love. Now, Gandhi, as you know, was a Hindu. So he's not professing the same Christianity as the person that says, well, you've got to walk down the aisle and you have to be baptized and you have to be part of my personal denomination or you're going to hell. Like, he has a much broader understanding of it. Now, a lot of that's going to come from him going to seminary in Boston. So because he went to seminary in Boston, he was around a lot of the more liberal Christians, and he was able to build this liberal theology with that kind of knowledge. So man is a sinner by choice. Okay. So, and fate is not absolute. So if you believe that man is a sinner by choice, that gives him, a man, the ability to improve or make a situation worse. If you believe in hard absolute faith, there's nothing that can be done about anything. And you just have to sit there and take it until God changes it. Okay? Now, this is going to be important when he starts dealing with a guy named Joe H. Jackson. So Joe H. Jackson was considered the Black Pope. And he was in charge of the National Baptist Convention in the 60s. So he came up and he was ruling the National Baptist Convention with an iron fist. He became president, and then he removed the part of the Baptist Constitution that says you can only serve 2 terms as president.
Nice.
And so by the time Dr. King comes up, he's served 4 terms. So he's 20 years in by 1964. All right? So at the 1964 National Baptist Convention, there is a group of people that opposed Joe Jackson named the Taylor team. Pastor Taylor, I can't think of the city he was from. But Pastor Taylor opposed Joe H. Jackson. And one of Joe H. Jackson's main tenets was nonviolent direct action was against the Bible. Because he believed the Bible said that all people should respect and obey the authority of the government. And nonviolent direct action, the point of it was to have so many people breaking the law at one time that the jail's full. So because God said that you should obey your earthly masters, nonviolent direct action was wrong. Now, Joe H. Jackson did believe in desegregation and integration, but he supported the NAACP plan, which was to get it only through the courts and court action. So Brown v. Board, when you study that, you're going to see that it actually wasn't just one case. It was actually a series of cases for 20 years. And they built enough cases to demolish school segregation on the state level that they finally had enough precedents to take a case to the U.S. Supreme Court. But once that happened, the school desegregation law was removed. The segregation laws were removed in 1955. By 1964, it was like 2 or 3% of Southern schools were integrated because nobody in the South would enforce the law saying that black kids and white kids could go to school together. So even though Joe Jackson understood that legal action in and of itself isn't enough to bring about desegregation, he thought we should stick with the plan because it's what God wants us to do. And when God wants us to integrate, he'll allow us to integrate. So that's the difference between somebody believing fate is absolute and determined by God, and faith is actually the result of your choice, and you have some degree of movement within faith. Universal Brotherhood of Man. This is really important because he was able to build bridges with the NAACP, who was to his right. They did not believe in nonviolent direct action. The NAACP did not support the March on Washington in '64. And he also was able to work with people on his left, such as the Memphis Invaders, who a lot of people thought were just a street gang, but they actually were a black liberation organization, and they're composed of mainly poor people from the hood in Memphis. And they were very rambunctious, and they were accused of doing various crimes. But he was able to work with them, and he made them marshals in the second Memphis strike parade. And also, disparity is the result of social policy. This is huge because the prevailing idea at the time was that there's something just genetically wrong with black people. And that's why they have to be segregated and put in a separate quarantined area. So when you understand disparity as a result of social policy, that is the route to allow people to desegregate. If people still think that black people are inferior due to genetics, you can't desegregate at that point. So Dr. King just didn't say that. He brought up many scientists who agreed with the point. Du Bois, of course, Adrian Bond, Julian Bond's father, also Emil Durkheim. They all wrote extensive works talking about how even though there's differences between people as far as athletics and intelligence, as aggregate groups, there isn't a difference. So there's a body of work from 1920 to 1960 that dispelled the idea of genetic inferiority of races. So, and he brought that up many times, and he has plenty to back that up. So plenty of science backing that up. Okay, so the behaviors. So he saw social justice as a spiritual path. It wasn't just simply a way to get us good jobs or get us in better schools. The actual act of trying to improve your community would build you as a better Christian. And Christian to him means someone who interacts with the world chiefly through the principle of love. So when you're on these, marches and they throw rocks at you and spit at you and you don't retaliate, that's building who you are inside and in Christ, in his opinion. So that's why nonviolent direct action was so important. Now, so nonviolent direct action was challenged by Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael is the man who coined the phrase Black Power. And Stokely Carmichael saw nonviolent direct action as just a tactic. And when the tactic stopped working, you do something else. Okay? So when they were going to march in the March Against Fear through Mississippi. So James Meredith was the black man who integrated the University of Mississippi. And he's trying to get black people to vote in Mississippi. So his idea was to walk across the state from the northeast corner to the southwest corner, registering people to vote. Now, James Meredith is the ultimate libertarian. If any conservatives want to talk about black folks, they need to be studying James Meredith, all right? So James Meredith hated the idea of groups. So of course he's not going to ask the SCLC, CORE, anybody for any kind of help. He's going to do it by himself, and he has him and his 3 friends. So these 4 guys are going to walk through Mississippi and get everybody registered to vote. The second day he gets shot. So he's shot the second day he's out there. He didn't die. They got him to a hospital in time. And SCLC, so Dr. King flies into Mississippi. CORE, at that time it was Floyd McKissick, flies into Mississippi. And Stokely Carmichael, who's already in Mississippi, comes up to see about James Meredith, okay? So they're in the hospital room, and they're like, all right, James, you can't do this by yourself. And we also can't stop now, because if we stop now, they win. So how about this time we start back as a group and have all of us going down together? And he's like, oh, I don't want to do that. If he's against the idea. So he leaves it alone. So SNCC, CORE, and SCLC decide they're going to finish it in a march against fear. So SNCC and CORE are different than the SCLC because they want to have armed guards on the march. CORE had this group called the Deacons of Defense. And in Louisiana, which was more of a rural area, so you got to understand when you're having these protest strategies that work in rural areas may not work in urban areas and vice versa. So the reason you can have a nonviolent march in Birmingham is because when they bash your head in, the NBC will come down and film it. They're not doing that in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. They're not doing that in the middle of nowhere in Louisiana. So in Louisiana, they had dudes with shotguns marching with them so nobody messes with them. There's a whole story about the whole Deacons of Defense. So the CORE and SNCC is like, we're not going back walking through Mississippi without any armed guards. And so him and the SCLC start talking about it, and King actually allows for concealed carry, some of the CORE members to conceal carry on the march. So that was one of the things that kept them safe on the march against fear, and that's why they were able to walk through Mississippi like that. But that's the conversation you're having between those who believe in nonviolence as a spiritual path and a social strategy and a spiritual strategy, and those who see it as just a tactic. So one of the things that Carmichael did was he actually told King that he's really just using him to further his own Black Power message. So Stokely Carmichael was big in Loudoun County, Mississippi, and they were doing voter registration drives there for a long time. So that's when he first made the speech of Black Power. And now the SCLC had white people in it. So of course they feel uncomfortable about the phrase Black Power. So the SCLC decided that their mantra for the march was going to be freedom now, and CORE and SNCC was yelling Black Power. So they had to come to those kind of compromises to make the march against fear work, okay? So Stokely Carmichael actually said that what he wanted to do was show that the nonviolent direct action wasn't going to work. And then once you show that, that would give people motivation to start arming themselves and be willing to fight back. So he had the whole Mississippi Freedom Party. He was trying to work with the political party. And in Where Are We Now?, King explains why he was against the Mississippi Freedom Party. He was saying that if you have an all-black political party, even in Mississippi, there's only 9 counties that are majority black. So even if they win all 9 counties, that's not enough representatives in the state house to get legislation done. And then on a national level, that's nowhere near enough people to get people on the national level. So King was actually working through this whole thing pragmatically, whereas Stokely Carmichael was about separation and arming yourself and things like that. So when you start talking about things like that, that's what you're talking about. He was always clear to criticize groups and not individuals, because he understood that we were all ultimately on the same side. So, of course, you know that Malcolm X didn't agree with King's strategy a lot of times. And Malcolm X always came after King personally. And even one time he accused them of the march being solely supplied by white liberals up north. And so King never criticized Malcolm X directly. He always criticized the strategy of the Nation of Islam. He also said that the NOI had little influence outside of the northern ghettos, and that it wasn't, their philosophy wasn't based on love. And the anti-war stance. So somebody who believes in nonviolence to improve their own situation also believes that other people should be using nonviolence. So one of the things King said is, you can't applaud us for being nonviolent in Birmingham and then say it's okay to invade Vietnam. So that was his basis to be against Vietnam. Now this is huge because they were just now getting headway with LBJ and JFK. So LBJ was hell-bent on going into Vietnam. So most of the people in the SCLC advised King not to speak on Vietnam because that's not our fight and we can't stop them from invading Vietnam anyway. But King understood the importance and the principle, and that's why I think that he's green meme and not orange meme, because he stuck to the principle of love, even if it meant that he's going to be ostracized from the Democratic Party, and it could actually hurt his own cause for his own people.
I thought he didn't start talking about the anti-war stuff until later.
Yes, it was 67, April 3rd, 1967, and a year later he was shot in the mouth. So that's one of the reasons why people have the conspiracy theories. So King also supported Palestinian rights because he understood, and that was one of the big rifts between him and a lot of the Jewish organizations that helped him out a lot. He felt that going to Israel, if you go there and then you start treating Palestinians poorly, that's going to be just as bad as people treating you poorly in Europe. So he did support Palestinians' rights. And he also had a detailed policy on social reform, which I'm going to get into later, I think. I think that's a more of a fourth quadrant issue. Making sure I'm not forgetting anything in the upper right quadrant. Okay. So on the collective. So this is the lower left-hand quadrant, and this is going to be the principles of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and also later in his life, the Poor People's Campaign. So when he made the SCLC, he had 10 fundamental values, and these are the values. Meditate daily on the teachings of the life of Jesus Christ. Remember always that nonviolent movements seek justice and reconciliation, not victory. So the point about that's interesting is after the Montgomery campaign, they won the right to sit on the front of a bus, and they ended segregation on buses. But after that, he had a class on teaching black people how to interact with whites on integrated buses. And one of the things he wanted to make sure people did was don't gloat on the fact that you could sit in the front now. Don't back down if you want to sit in the front, but also don't gloat or throw in people's faces that you can sit in the front. And he also said that he was very disappointed that none of the white clergy in Birmingham was willing to have a class with his people to teach them how to interact on a segregated bus. Because the point of King wasn't to integrate into America. It was to build a new integrated America. So that would take change on both the part of whites and the part of blacks. And I think that's one of the biggest problems in America now. There was never that class or a space where white people could get together and unpack their views on race. And if that had happened, it would be a totally different situation now. Third was walk and talk in the matter of love of God, and for God is love. Prayer daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. Seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. 9. Refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, and heart. Strive to be the spiritual food for body and health, and follow the directions of the movement and the captain of demonstration. So, the SELC, as I said earlier, was actually in opposition to the majority of the black church, because a lot of the black church believed that we were the meek that would inherit the earth. So we are being discriminated against and segregated against, and then when Jesus comes back, he's going to give us the earth. So our job was to be able to endure the punishment and the strife and not be upset by it. So he was actually moving past most of the black church there. And he also differed from a lot of the left, more militant black leaders, because he believed America was fundamentally sound and redeemable. Okay? Guys like Stokely Carmichael and later the Black Panthers, they see America as unredeemable, and America has to be completely defeated for black people to get ahead. So this idea of the fundamental altruism of the Constitution is huge in the philosophy of King, and he separates you from a lot of the other people. So I see King as kind of like in the middle of the 60s, of the black thought in the 60s. To the right of him would be the NAACP, who was always against protests. They were against the March on Washington. Thurgood Marshall said that King was just like a young rabble-rouser that spends up all NAACP money because the NAACP has to come down there and fight and get the protesters out of jail. Okay? And then that's what Thurgood Marshall said. Like, they weren't friends. Like, that's the thing. Like, people think that all these guys were friends and they got along. Like, no, very few of them actually got along.
Wow.
And then also there's this guy that I'm studying now, a guy named Elder Lightfoot Solomon Michaud. And he was the first man, black or white, to have a televangelist show, and also the first man to have a radio show. He lived here in D.C., and he broadcast out of Arlington, Virginia. Okay? So he was against Dr. King because he saw he was black. He was actually Creole. He was mixed, black, white, and Indian. But he believed that slavery and segregation was a necessary tool to civilize black people. And this is a black man saying this. And that he felt like what should happen is the church should be integrated. And once the church is integrated, Jesus will come into everybody's heart. And then once Jesus comes into everybody's heart, people will naturally want to integrate. So to agitate from the outside for integration was wrong. We should sit and wait for Jesus to come and integrate us. And so he was the most prominent black preacher at that time. He actually had revivals at Griffith Stadium, which was where the National played at the time.
I watched the Senators there.
Yeah, the Senators. Sorry. I'm a historian. I should have got that right. So he had revivals at Griffith Stadium, and it was actually a lot of black and white people in Washington would come. He was like the first mega church guy, and that's what he was preaching. So that was to the right of King. Now to the left of King, like I said before, you had Stokely Carmichael, who believed that we'll do nonviolence for a little while. Once nonviolence doesn't work, we'll start to arm ourselves. And then once we start arming ourselves, we can try to take down the government. So Stokely Carmichael was actually working with the socialist group in Latin America, training himself up for war and war strategy. And also, after the Civil Rights Movement, he got training in Africa and fought in African liberation movements, too. So, and then, of course, you had the Black Panthers, too. So that was to the right. So I see King as like the center of the thought at the time. Another thing about, this is the thing about the quadrant. Sometimes like the thing you want to talk about kind of bleeds over from interior and exterior. So I think this will be a good segue then to the next lower right quadrant. So nonviolent direct action doesn't just get the result of integrating America. What it also does is it builds unity within the black community, and it also allows white people to come on the side of liberation without feeling threatened. So just like any other group of people, black people have class distinctions too. So you have more educated people and less educated people. So the NAACP, their strategy was to work through court cases, all right? Now, when you do that, it makes the wealthier, more educated black people like heroin saving everybody else. Also, the NAACP had a hard time taking on cases that were a little bit more controversial, okay? So one of the things about Thurgood Marshall is he only took your case for desegregation if you were well overqualified to go to the school, you were extremely well dressed and well presented, and you spoke well. Because they didn't want to put forth this idea that black people are slow and ignorant and things like that. Now, the problem with that is black people who are having the worst time aren't being helped by the NAACP. One of the things that the NAACP was chastised for was the North Carolina kissing case. So in North Carolina, there was 2 black boys and a 13-year-old white girl. And apparently they were playing out in the parking lot, and the white girl kissed the black boy. And so both black kids wound up in jail. And they were going to be in jail till they were like 30-something years old. And so Robert Williams actually, he was in NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. He wrote the national head to send a lawyer down to get these boys out of jail. And they wouldn't send anybody out because they were scared that if they did, they'd be considered of promoting misogyny. And, you know, it's a 10-year-old boy, you know. So what Robert Williams did, he actually was part of an international underground socialist organization. So he had sent the story to France, Hungary, Austria, and they put it out there. And so many Europeans got upset, they threw rocks at the American embassy at those cities. And it was so shameful that the governor of North Carolina acquitted their sentences and got them out of jail. So that's the kind of stuff that you deal with when you start talking about the NAACP. Like, there was a lot of good they did, but they left a lot of us out to dry too. And so that's why it's so important with nonviolent direct action, because protesting and marching is something that everybody can do. You could be barely literate and do it. You could be the richest guy in the county and do it. And so by bringing everybody together in this march, you actually build unity in the black community. And also, because you can go down and face down the police and they have a standoff and you stand strong through it, it builds your own sense of self-esteem and your own sense of strength and your own sense of faith in your community. So it builds a stronger black community. Because it's nonviolent and they profess their love of the Constitution also and the love of Jesus, a white person could come on board of that and not feel threatened. They don't have to feel like we're going to riot and kill them all and like take over. So that is a behavior, a collective behavior in lower right, but in the lower left, it does a lot of good for the lower left. So that's a good segue to the lower right fourth quadrant. Yes, black social justice philosophy. Again, King is one of the most well-written people you'll ever study. He built his philosophy chiefly off of the life of Jesus Christ, a deep understanding of it. He was also influenced by Plato. If you listen to the I've been to the mountaintop speech, he talks about Plato in there. He speaks on Nietzsche. He speaks on Marx. He was a good friend of Reinhold Niebuhr. He actually invited Reinhold Niebuhr to the March on Fear, the one through Mississippi. But Niebuhr was too old to come. He was really old and sickly at the time. So he put together a lot of...
I don't know who he is.
Oh, Reinhold Niebuhr is... he is a Christian theologian, and he really brought socialism into Christianity in a lot of ways. But at the end, he actually changed a lot, and he said it was okay to use physical force, militarism, to stop the spread of communism, which he saw as fascism. So he was a leading...
Serenity prayer, too.
Yeah, he did do the Serenity Prayer, but he was a lot deeper than that.
Yeah, I know, but that's just one of the things. He's a famous theologian of the 20th century.
Yeah, and he also talked a lot about how poor people will have this kind of feudal idea of rich people, where instead of seeing themselves as opposition of the rich, they'll see themselves as an extension of the rich. So they'll say, oh, well, if it's good for the CEO of my company, then that's good for me. That's where a lot of the right-wing ideology comes in, from this actual feudal idea of, I'm an extension of this rich person.
Where have we seen that?
No, I don't know where I've seen that before. But Reinhold Niebuhr, but if we had been reading Niebuhr this whole time, we could have avoided this. So if we had those areas for white people to unpack their whiteness, understand their whiteness, we could have a lot could have been avoided. So he was building a welfare state. So he believed in first off, he believed in affirmative action. Anybody who tells you different is just trying to gaslight you. He actually started an affirmative action program in Birmingham. He said that a certain percentage of the salesmen at Woolworths and other department stores had to be black. In Montgomery, he said that if the route had mostly black people on it, it should have a black bus driver. He advocated for that in Montgomery. So he was for affirmative action. So these right-wingers saying he wouldn't have been, don't believe him. He also supported the A. Philip Randolph Freedom Budget. Now, if you ever get a chance to read the Freedom Budget, definitely do it, because it sounds like something coming out of the Green Party. It involved environmentalism, being good to the environment, also guaranteed work for everyone in the country, improved SNAP, supplemental food assistance. King, this wasn't in the Freedom Budget. The Freedom Budget supported guaranteed work. But King actually independently supported universal basic income in 1964. So, that's huge. He did talk about redistribution of wealth. He did do that. He talked about in Chicago, one of the things they need to do is because schools are funded off of property taxes. So if you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have high value property, your school's going to be worse. So he advocated for taking tax money from a wealthy area and moving it into the inner city to improve the schools in Chicago. So he was for redistribution of wealth. So how he advocated for this was through the Poor People's Campaign. Now, this is coming later in his career. I want to say 66. Don't hold me to that. So the Poor People's Campaign was going to be a coalition of unions, politicians, social justice advocates, and they would all work together to move these policies forward. And that's what he really meant by the idea that I've integrated my people into a burning house. A lot of people will take the quote in 67. He says he's integrated his people into a burning house to mean that he was against integration. That's not what he was saying in that speech. What he was saying in that speech was that now that we've integrated, now we have to look at the building of a healthier house. And part of the building of a healthier house is ending militarism, ending poverty, and ending racial discrimination. All right? So the Poor People's Campaign was against the war. They were for building welfare programs. And he justified it, the redistribution of wealth, as something not new in America. One redistribution of wealth was the Homestead Act. The wealth the natives had was taken from them and redistributed to the homesteaders. So that was a redistribution of wealth. Another redistribution of wealth was government subsidized mortgages, the ones that black people couldn't get because they were black. So in the New Deal, they had government subsidized mortgages. You had to be white to get them. If one black person moved in your neighborhood, no one else in the neighborhood could get the loan. So a lot of the times when people got crosses burned in their yard and ran out of white neighborhoods, the government made them do that. When you think about it, the government motivated them to do that. It wasn't just a moral failing on the part of individual people. And that's one of the things I want to stress so much to the more neoliberal people. Like, racism isn't simply just the moral failing of individuals. It's actually a system of social policies that motivate people to act a certain way. And also tax cuts to tax breaks to big corporations. That's a redistribution of wealth. When they don't pay taxes, that means you do. So they're redistributing your wealth to the corporation. Now, King was amazing at building coalitions. So one coalition that I want to talk about is the Memphis Invaders. So the Invaders was a group of people in Memphis, and they originally called themselves the Black Liberation Organization. And so they were students at a local college that were studying sociology. And so they went back to Memphis, and they started studying the plight of poor black Memphians right there at home. It was a completely grassroots effort. And they actually was able to quantify the amount of poverty in the black neighborhoods. There was like one of the first sociological studies done in Memphis. Now, with that being said, they were still 21. So they had all the same problems any other 21-year-old from the inner city would have. So they were rowdy, they were rambunctious. They had a lot of speeches where they said stuff they probably shouldn't have said. I mean, really inflammatory stuff. And they were accused of causing a riot before. Now, when King had his first march in Memphis, it ended in a riot. Now, no one knows who started the riot, okay? But the Memphis Invaders were accused of it. So the Invaders, they were actually invited to the SCLC meeting. Now, everyone else in the SCLC did not want them there. They called them thugs. And they were wearing dashikis also. They wore African garb and dashikis. So these church folks didn't want to see all these people walking around in African clothing, because they saw themselves as the genteel, aristocratic people that wore suits and professed Jesus. They didn't talk about all this wild jungle mumbo jumbo stuff. So there was a prejudice there between them and the Memphis Invaders. Now, King, being who he was, understood how important it was to bring young people in. So King brings them in and says, look, I want you guys to be the marshals on the second march. So he removes the element of violence by making them in charge of keeping the peace.
Wow.
And I think that's like that's a genius idea on the part of King. And King's like one of the few people that can actually do something like that. He also worked with the Peace Stone Rangers in the Chicago campaign, okay? Oh, you don't know who they are. Like I said, the Black Peace Stone Rangers, Power Stone Rangers, were another black liberation organization out of Chicago. Like the Invaders were the Memphis Panthers, Black Panthers. Peace Stone Rangers were the Chicago Panthers, okay? So they, again, very Afrocentric. Their emblem was the pyramid. But they worked with him closely in Chicago to get things done. And that was needed because Joe H. Jackson's home church was in Chicago. And Joe H. Jackson was doing everything he could to undermine Dr. King in Chicago. So it came in handy having these people with him. He was also deeply opposed to both communism and imperialism. So one of the things people try to say about King even now is that he was a communist. He definitely wasn't a communist. He actually saw communism as the biggest threat to Christianity. And he said it's the biggest threat of Christianity because if Christians don't get up and come up with a tangible social justice philosophy that addresses your poverty and your actual condition you're living in, people are going to stop believing. And so communism was on the rise because they had suggestions and they had things that could help your actual life as you're living it now. And so King spoke extensively against communism and, of course, imperialism we talked about before. You can't be for nonviolence in Birmingham and be for violence in Vietnam. That makes no sense. And so if you want people to act nonviolently towards you when you're wrong, you have to then act nonviolently towards somebody else who you don't agree with. So I think that is King in 4 quadrants. And I want to stop for questions because we've been going an hour. So anybody have any questions?
It's a lot to absorb.
Well, that discussion about between Thurgood Marshall and
King.
and King is fascinating because that's not really well known, I don't think.
A lot of this isn't well known. Him and Joe Jackson, the 1964 National Baptist Conference broke out into a fight. So Taylor's team actually stormed the stage when Joe Jackson's supporters were on it because they're like, you're not going to just not let us talk. Like, that's not going to happen. So they stormed the stage. So when they stormed the stage, a fight broke out, and one of the old guy fell off the stage and hit his head and died.
Damn.
And so they covered it up because they don't want that kind of bad publicity. But after that, the Taylor team actually leaves the National Baptist Convention, and they make the Progressive National Baptist, and that's still in operation today. But that was the minority in the National Baptist Convention, and King joins it 3 years later because they tried to blame King for the problem, even though King wasn't even there. And just so people know, L. Booth started the Progressive National Baptist Conference, not Taylor, because a lot of people, historians, get that wrong. It was a different guy who actually decided to make a separate convention for Baptists, and that's the Progressive National Baptist Convention. It's still in operation today.
I get a sense of sadness to realize how incredibly advanced King was, how brilliant, how he had the potential, he could have brought us together. It's like thinking back, did we really walk on the moon? We got that far, and now we've fallen back so far? It's so great.
I know, and it's really sad that people misconstrue what he said even today. I get so mad when I hear a right-winger try to say he would be a Republican now or something like that. Like, people obviously haven't read him, and don't know the first thing about him, talking about him. And honestly, I think a lot of people haven't studied him to the level they need to, before they start talking about him.
Well, if you just go down and read the quotes that are carved in the granite downtown, they're breathtaking.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, I mean, the mountaintop speech, I've been to the mountaintop speech, that's probably my favorite speech of King. If it's like a 2 or 3 pages or a short thing you want to read, that'd be the one to read. Because he goes through his whole philosophy. And I also enjoy the fact that he had a deep salience for America. And I myself, I consider I have a salience for America. Salience is a term used by Will Cross, the guy who did Nigresance, the ego development method for black people. And he talks about how people have different saliences and different identities that they hold. And being American, to me, is something I pride myself in. And a lot of times when you talk to other black people about that, they kind of see it as something that's not as good. But I like that he was able to, his patriotism was so sacrificing. He wanted to build a better America. And he was willing to go to jail himself to build the better America. He wasn't demanding somebody else to change. He was willing to make the sacrifice. And I think that's huge.
It takes courage.
Yeah.
So real insight. I mean, you have to be really, really committed to what you see.
Yeah. So you want to stop for a second?
See why.
Okay.